Oh, good.
Hospitals.
In some sense, it's all on kind of autopilot. In some sense, it's the usual fires that appear when something is on autopilot like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, I think Nikesh is a lot more affected by it than I am. But, you know, Chad is working.
Yeah.
I mean, radiology area is like gung ho. Yeah, I was just talking to him this morning about.
He seems like a nice, kind,
Very chill, very like even keel. Yeah. But you get him after hours.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
I'll tell you that. He has like 8 bottles of tequila. Because of all of his hijinks with the Mexican Radiology Society.
All right.
You guys, agentic coding in your workflow that you can run securely in the cloud. I think that's the huge acceleration.
He's been pushing this report drafting stuff. We just did a couple of pilots and stuff. I mean, the test people were like, well, it's made some mistakes.
Yeah, that's the model issue. It's just, you're still running out of oral meaning, which is supposed to be replicated.
No, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of something else.
Okay.
I'm talking about report drafting.
Oh, drafting the report from the.
This is the mosaic. I don't know if you know mosaic yet. Not the summarization. Yeah, the summarization, that's had issues too, but.
Hello.
I think that's, everything is gonna work, it's just, there's some things to work out.
It's like first pass, will be 15% errors.
Yeah.
Did you have slides you might want to share?
I do.
Okay, settle down.
I do.
I would actually recommend just connecting to the Zoom meeting, then treat it as a Zoom meeting. Did you want to go first, second, third?
What are you talking about?
I'm gonna just, I sent the slides, I mean, I'm kind of overview of what we do for data and why it's important.
Okay. And then what's Jason talking about?
His experience trying to get some data set release.
Okay.
So you're probably third.
I'm probably third, yeah, I'm synthetic data, so I'm talking about, thank you so much. I'm gonna talk about like, you know.
Yeah, it's like, hey, let alone real data getting
Yeah,
out there
yeah.
to process where is it for synthetic.
Exactly.
Great.
Okay.
So probably Curt, Jason,
Okay.
and then. Be great. Thank you for doing this.
So I'm teaching, I don't know why I agreed to this, because I'm teaching on campus, and I'm like looking at my clock, I'm like, okay, guys, class is ended right.
Oh, okay, I was gonna say, did you want to go first or last? But it sounds like it's
No,
already, game's already over.
but it was like the, whew.
It'll be good.
It'll be fine, yeah.
Do I need to turn my microphone back on for this, or?
No, the room itself is microphone, and that black thing, I think, is the microphone. Alright, so we'll get started in just a couple minutes, everybody. We got a whole illustrious panel here wrangling, and it will be exciting and very relevant. Complex questions that keep coming up. And the answers may be different now than they were a few years ago. Jason, I just tried to promote you to a panelist, by the way. I'm just see what the line looks like outside. Is it cool? Okay, we'll probably get started about just one more minute. And Tina, are you being recorded or not?
Yeah, yeah.
And then once I see you, I'll promote you to panelist. All right, since Curt comes back, we'll get started. All right, already 60 people online and more coming in. Fantastic. Actually, I'd like to go ahead and get started because I'm sure we have a very rich discussion. We have a very rich set of panelists and more in the audience who have experience on these very complex but relevant issues more than ever. You want to understand how computation and data affects real people, you kind of need real data at the end of the day. Native cases only get so far, but you can't just share real patient data out in the wild arbitrarily. There are very serious privacy and security issues that people probably underestimate. So rather than just guessing, there actually are policies, approaches, best practices for not very well defined things. Why don't we hear straight from people who have battled this out already and can tell us the best practices. Dr. Curt Langlotz, so maybe just also a 30-second introduction of who you are, and then dive in and tell us some of your best lessons.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Curt Langlotz, on the faculty of Radiology, Medicine, and Biomedical Data.
Sorry, go ahead.
Start over?
Yeah.
I'm Curt Langlotz, faculty in Radiology, Medicine, and Biomedical Data Science, and Director of the Center for AI in Medicine and Imaging, and have a role in the Provost Office related to AI and Data Science. And the AD Center has a long history of sharing data publicly, and so just wanted to give you very briefly 5-10 minutes of background on the work that we've been doing, and really looking forward to hearing what others on the panel have to say today as well, and the discussion to follow. So I'd like to start with this just as context. We're talking about the latest wave of AI is machine learning from data, and I think we've been through 2 eras, starting on a third. The era of research, this was early on, supervised learning, labels needed, labels very expensive, data sets tended to be large by historical standards, but still small. For the last 5 years, we've been in an era of scale, particularly when it comes to these commercial language models, where the CEO of a big company can say, I know reliably that if I spend a lot of money on compute and lots of data, and I have more compute and more data, I'm going to get better and better performance, which is kind of a nice place to be if you're a CEO, to not have to invest in some researcher who's going to go out and speculate and maybe find some ways to innovate. And so that's been a huge investment that we've seen. But I think we may be, particularly when it comes to commercial language models, getting back to this era of research where we're thinking about how do you optimize the way that we train these models with the data and the compute that we have. And we've seen like DeepSeek and some of the smaller models are actually getting that kind of performance. But I do want to say that that's true. We're kind of on the shoulder of that curve probably for these large commercial language models. But I would say in radiology and probably in healthcare, we are still way down on this curve. We have not, because of privacy and other reasons, we have not aggregated data to the size that has been done outside of medicine. I just did this is a little bit old now, but looked at the size of the largest data set used to train an AI model. Inside medicine in the purple, outside medicine in the blue. It's a log scale, so this is like 100x difference in size. In text and then images, it's the same. Just for reference, I have the Stanford data sets plotted on here. So we can really substantially close that gap. Obviously, you want to train a multi-institutional model, but we have this healthcare data, it's just we haven't put it together in that scale. And people start to see these kinds of leaps in performance as we get larger and larger data sets, and that's something that we're working on in imaging for sure, and in other areas too, as you know. We looked at the ethics of sharing with David Magnus, one of our ethicists here, as well as a bunch of radiologists. This applies to imaging, but I think really works well for other data as well. We really believe that after the data are used to provide clinical care, the primary purpose for the data is fulfilled, and so at that point the data should be used as a form of a public good. So they're not owned by anyone, and we all are stewards of the data. And so what we've done at the AD Center is we have developed with the university and the hospital a method to release data widely with a click-through type of a license. It took a long time. This was actually the idea of Matt Lundgren, and I have to confess that when Matt came to me in maybe 2018 saying I want to do this, I said, forget it, it'll never work. But he persuaded me and really was persistent, and it took us maybe a year or more to work through all of the issues, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But the idea is that we have researchers here doing AI work. They pull together data, they clean it up, they make it beautiful, they make it AI ready, they do their experiment, they publish their paper, and then along with the paper they can release the data publicly. And our website is one way to do that. We have, I think, 25-ish data sets. So what are the issues that we faced? Here are all of the barriers that we faced along the way. Many are no privacy offices. So there's a children's hospital, an adult hospital, a university, they all have privacy offices. We had to figure out which one of those was going to be the primary. They decided that the adult hospital was going to be the primary, so we worked with them. We initially had an IRB for every data release, and finally the IRB said, go away. This is not research. Anyone who uses this data needs an IRB, but just releasing it is not research, so you don't need an IRB. So we got rid of that. Risk aversion, it's a big one. Yeah, everyone has this. You know, what if there's something in there we don't know? And one of the things that we did is we worked with them on, we do electronic de-identification, and then we have a manual review of every data point to double check that there's no PHI. That's a lot easier to do with images than with other types of data. So our data has focused mainly on imaging, some radiology reports, some smaller structured data sets. I know Jason's going to talk about some of the issues with larger data sets. Larger EHR data sets, we haven't fully worked through those issues. Routine work. Consent, we had to go back through with the Office of General Counsel to look at whether the consents were that we obtained at the time the data was used for clinical care, whether those patient consents were consistent with what we wanted to do. We concluded ultimately that they were. I think that language is being revised now to make it consistent with the modern world of modern AI. Data use agreements, so we worked that up with lawyers from the OTL, which is a click-through license. De-identification, we had to develop in our lab some tools for de-identifying radiology reports. We're now working with Todd's team on kind of the best de-identification tools for text radiology reports and other text documents. Not too much trouble with format. Most of the images are in DICOM, but that can be an issue. Data hosting, so initially this was on Box, and literally my administrative assistant, every time someone requested the data, had to go in and approve their email address to access the Box file. We obviously, that was not sustainable with growth, so we then partnered with Microsoft. Even that had trouble because it was a custom build by someone who's no longer there, and they had no interest in maintaining it, so we're now moving to Redibus, which is a platform that's really a nice university licensed platform for data access and data sharing. And then cost. So we paid for this out of some of our affiliates, Data Center, and through grants. Okay, so that's how we did it. And then just very quickly, some other issues. So you say, oh, that's great. You have all these AI-ready data sets. That's maybe more data sets than any other place is released. But that's really not enough because that's just one place. That's Stanford. So we're not necessarily, if you're training on those data, you're not getting the right answer for other places. This was Amit Kaushal and Russ Altman and I did this work in 2020. Published in JAMA, where we looked at where do the training data sets come from, what states in the US for the models that are published in the literature, and the majority of data comes from just 3 states. And the same is true internationally, by the way, heavily weighted towards certain countries. And so, this is my last slide. I think this is a very expensive option. This is an NIH-funded central imaging curation and repository for AI-ready imaging data. It was started by funding from COVID, and we very intentionally in this project collected data from a diverse set of sites around the country, so it has really good real-world variability. And you can see there that this is just on one dimension, the demographic mix actually does match the census quite well. So if you train on this data, you're getting you're training a model that might be more likely to be generalizable. But it's expensive, right? This was millions and millions, really tens of millions of dollars to build this thing. And there are really no great sustainable models, and the NIH has no appetite to continue to fund something of that size over time. So that's something that we're working on now, is what are the sustainable models for data sharing. So that's kind of my core dump on data sharing, and I will look forward to hearing what others have to say. Thank you.
Great. Jason, why don't you show slides? Kurt, before you step away while Jason's getting set up. Can you motivate a little more like the why? Why bother going through all that trouble? You already have the Stanford data. Why do you want to bother making it public? Why did Matt do that, and why did you let them?
Yeah. Well,
Jason, can you say something?
Two reasons. One is what I said, which is we think it's a public good. It's something that, if you want to accelerate progress in machine learning, you want to make data as widely available as possible so that people can train better models, more generalizable models. So that's number one. Number two is it actually probably more than any other thing that we have done at the Amy Center, that has drawn others to us. And we are seen as thought leaders in the area because we do this. And I think part of that too is just that if you give someone in their lab something that they can actually use, they remember you for that. And so that's been a nice side effect.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Jason Fries, one of our very brand new faculty, been working in many capacities. So glad to hear it, and tell us some of your experiences.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really building on Curt's really great introduction. This will be much shorter. I just wanted to similarly sort of set the landscape in terms of how AI has really been evolving since deep learning entered the scene, which really started this era where just scaling data enables almost magical abilities. And if we think about it in the terms of where label comes from, or supervision in the machine learning lingo, ChatGPT really changed, was the next big phase shift in our thinking. And what it has ultimately done is, data is the arbiter of success nowadays. That's why if you look at frontier language model papers, the data section is often like a paragraph, even though that's the actual determiner of who leads the best performance. So now it's a trade secret, and it really is, as scientists, it is the reason these models are so capable of doing things. And what's really happened is that the capabilities of generative AI have become so expressive that the bottlenecks of data and thinking has shifted. And now the bottleneck is evaluating these models with rigor and finding their alignment in real world use cases, which is the tee up for why data sets that are realistic in high stakes settings like healthcare are more important than ever to understanding how models behave and how they can fail in the real world. So this really was the impetus when I was working at NIGM's lab. This is very much a collaboration with NIGM's efforts to really think about what are the limitations in AI, EHR, electronic health record data sets today. And the limitation really is that, we follow the guiding light of PhysioNet, who has released the MIMIC data set that is released in the late aughts, I believe, but has really been one of the most transformative contributions to healthcare AI anywhere in the recent memory. And so we were inspired by that to think about how we could release longitudinal data sets, particularly ones combined with multimodal data, say CT scans, under the assumption that imaging alone is missing an important context to describe what we actually need to make predictions and make models useful. So we have released 3 data sets of EHR, and I'll go a little bit through the process. This was a many-year process, honestly, to conceive the data sets and get permission to release them in a secure, patient, privacy-respecting way. So both the EHR data sets and the models are available now. You can actually download them if you'd like to use them. In a testament to being a baby PhysioNet, we have over 1,500 users, and so I manually approve every application of these data sets. So I see the level of enthusiasm and awesome project ideas that are inspired by these new types of data basically every week. And it's very affirming to see that kind of impact. We're also working on making a bunch of stuff available to reproduce some stuff that's work in progress. But it goes without saying that it is immensely complicated to secure a release of these data sets, and they are not released in the same way that Curt outlined with imaging, where we did do an imaging release, so I'll talk about that in a sec, but these are not strictly de-identified data sets. These are data sets that have been scrubbed of PHI and accompany very strict legal guidance and data use agreements that restrict where they can live, how they can be used, they cannot be disseminated by other entities. And so there's quite a bit of restrictions on what you can do with these data, but they are available for research in a way much like PhysioNet, and they are very different. But this is just a laundry list of the many offices, starting of course with an IRB, that you have to navigate and go through to secure permissions to a private point where you can upload it to an honest sort of vendor site like Reddit is. The complexity of the EHR data, I won't go too deep into this, but to ensure that it's not a leakage or an adversarial attack against this data doesn't risk re-identifying individuals, all data has to respect what's called a different code book. That is different identifiers, different time jitters, and you have to basically translate into a mirror universe of a set of augmentations to preserve an anonymity under this protocol that TDS and others have developed to be able to release data. So we have this quite complicated diagram to show how you can create a data set that is aligned with data sets that are released internally, which turns out to be pretty critical for actually doing any benchmarking work and validation, because any drift in an extremely complicated longitudinal data set causes all kinds of problems when you're doing benchmarking and model training. We followed really on the coattails of Amy to be able to release any imaging data sets. Really thanks to the just incredible team at Amy, volunteers, really literally 6 months of manual review of 23,000 CT scans in a PHI compliant GCP container app to flag as containing PHI or not, to be able to ascertain that they are suitable for release. And these are hosted on the Amy Center. Hosting, EHR is hosted on this site called Hernandez-Boussard that Curt talked about. It is quite nice in that it provides compute, actually. You can actually run compute analyses entirely in the sandbox of Hernandez-Boussard. That's something I think we should look into more for releases of data set that we don't want people to download. Particularly, I think that's an interesting mechanism other places have looked at. But you can provide a very fine-grained control over access and permission and auditing and checking for compliance. And so this is just the set of requirements to be able to download your shot at a data set of 7,000 patients, which is currently one of the most cited benchmark papers in EHR at the moment, which is also pretty affirming. So open challenges moving forward that I hope we can talk about today during the panel is that we really want a consistent approval process for data sets writ large, so that it's consistent across everyone at the university. I think that is a very complicated discussion that not every individual lab can afford to have. We also need to know that data has very different risk profiles. We're doing work with AI-assisted tumor boards and thinking about pathology slides. Those are very different levels of identifying information versus, say, EHR. It should be much easier to release some classes of data than others, and certainly they're all about the same level of human review. We need to develop licensing language. We developed through the Office of General Counsel, a DUA, NeurIPS, to be able to download data sets in the same style as Mimic, but in reality, that only covers the data. I think these days the model is actually really interesting and powerful, particularly when it can generate synthetic data at incredible fidelity. What are the rules and limitations on distilling all of Stanford out into a commercial model? That's a very serious concern that has been really top of mind as we think about potentially even releasing models, because it is a new risk frontier of attacks and interesting implications. So we need licensing and protection there on the model side, specifically for the models. And we need guidance on releasing synthetically generated or augmented data in a landscape where we can make very fluent and realistic looking data seeded potentially with some realistic distribution to make it actually useful for ML. And how does this impose limitations on the scale and what we can release in certain clips. So that is it. So I don't know. Tina.
Excellent, thanks so much. We'll turn it over to Dr. Hernandez-Boussard, who has many expertise, but also recently has publications thinking about synthetic uses and beyond.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so we've heard like sort of this evolution of data sharing from images to EHR, and I want to talk to you about like synthetic data. And so I had the opportunity to host a meeting at NIH 2 years ago about data provenance and how we think about how we keep track of where data originated and where it actually ends up in our models. And so out of this workshop, we wrote this paper on synthetic data, synthetic trust. So let me kind of walk you through like our thinking on this. So we've just heard, right? I mean, the data problem, right? We need to share data We need to make sure it's clinically meaningful, and we need to ensure that it's privacy preserving, right? And so these are very important issues, and you rarely get all three in a bundle, right? You can optimize for access, or you can optimize for clinical fidelity, but you can't really have both, right? And so a lot of people have been looking at synthetic data to address this problem, right? So we can have synthetic data has been shown to really help with these privacy constraints. And there's a lot of work being done on this where you can really de-identify these data using synthetic data. It can address the problem with limited access because Stanford won't let us share our data, but I can create a synthetic data set and be able to distribute that more easily. And then it also addresses this notion for need for scale, right? So we can just augment our data with synthetic data. But I want to bring you back to this reality of clinical data, right? So Jason kind of was showing, and Curt also, how complex our data is, right? And it's important to understand that not only is it complex, but it's also very biased in every sense of the way, right? So the way we collect our data, our workflows, access to care, these are all integrated into our clinical data that we have. And when we think about augmenting it with synthetic data, we need to think very carefully about how the complexity and the biases of these data come into our data generation processes. And so I want to just tell you this illusion about like big data and big diversity. And this is kind of one of the main things that came out of our workshop at NIH, because our example was, okay, I have a data set, I have 10 Native American patients that, I just don't have enough patients to do anything with when I do subpopulation experiments or validations, et cetera. So, I can augment that data set and have now 1,000 Native American or, patients. And so the question is this more data better than my original 10 patients, right? So we're taking these 10 patients and moving them to 1,000. So for model building, statistical properties of the data set, right, it might look great. But your original data is only 10 patients, right? And so the rules of theory are that you cannot have more diversity than the original data set. So what we're really doing is you're taking these 10 patients and you're amplifying all the biases within these patients, and you're saying that these 10 patients represent the entire population, right? So there's big issues with how we think about augmenting these data using synthetic data to address diversity and big data, right? And so we identified 4 major failures when using synthetic data for augmenting clinical data. So the first one is you lose clinically significant cases, right? So when you generate synthetic data, rare conditions get dropped, right? Your tails get removed. Everything gets smoothed over, right? So a lot of these really interesting cases you have in your clinical data disappear, right? And this was the paper, sorry, that if you want to get more details on this. And also your intersectional groups are often underrepresented, right? So this whole piece of your clinical complexity gets washed out in your clinical data, in your synthetic data. Second failure is you break these clinical relationships, okay? So you have these variable interactions get distorted, comorbidity patterns get lost, and your temporal structure gets weakened, right? So say for example, we know that obesity plus a particular social determinant of health are very predictive of severity of diabetes. Well, that complexity gets washed out in your synthetic data, okay? Third failure is that the intersectional hallucinations, right? And so this is a big one that we found that keeps coming out, right? So false associations become created, and real associations between all this complexity in our data get lost, okay? And so we create patients that never existed, and we often remove our most complex cases, ones we probably want to learn more about. And And then the fourth failure is model collapse. And so this is something that was reported on a lot back in 2024, where the large language models started creating synthetic data to train their models. They ran out of data, and then the models just seem to collapse, right? They start to fail after a certain moment. And this is because we reduce variation, right? We lose our tail distributions, and it just degrades over time. So there's been this disproportionately impacts, right, our rare conditions and our rare diseases. And so then so those were our four constraints. So when you think about this balance between fidelity versus privacy, right, there's no free lunch. You can't optimize for both, right? If the more privacy preserving your synthetic data set is, the less closer to reality it is, and vice versa, right? And so it's really important when we think about creating this synthetic data, we think about how we're gonna balance this trade-off. Failures are connected, right? And so our bias gets amplified, our rare cases get removed, our relationships get distorted, and our models collapse. So this affects the stability of the data, right? So but it also means that we generate this huge data set, right? And we get artificial confidence in the model. And this is what we're calling synthetic trust. And so synthetic trust, right, is where we have these large synthetic data sets. We have narrow confidence intervals. We have, higher apparent accuracy, right? And we have stable estimates. So if you're naive, that leads you to think, man, this is a great way to really augment my models, to really augment the types of analyses I'm doing, but it creates false confidence, right? Because I just showed you, we're losing all of these really important connections that are in real clinical data. And so the synthetic trust is the illusion that statistical confidence implies clinical truth, okay? And so, in our paper, we go through a bunch of safeguards you need to think about when using synthetic data. We have a whole list of about 20 things you need to talk about. How you generated the synthetic data, your real patient to synthetic ratio, violations against real data, but then also how you would deploy models created on synthetic data in the real system, right? And what types of additional checks need to go into that. And so what we need, of course, are specific data lineage, like that data provenance is key when we're using the synthetic data in healthcare, right? Violations against real world distortions. And you need to do these clinical plausibility checks, right? Because we've seen when models are using these synthetic data, we get these really weird associations that don't make sense clinically. So with that, this really requires a shift between scale and fidelity, a shift between competence and convenience and validity, and this shift between synthetic trust and verified trust.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Are there people really using synthetic data to make discoveries?
What's that?
Are there people using synthetic data to make discoveries?
There certainly are. There certainly are.
What counts as a discovery?
Exactly.
I mean,
So I'm going to stop there. This was work that I did with a bunch of people. So happy to turn it over to the panel. Hopefully, between the three of us, we all gave you lots to think about.
Excellent, fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez-Boussard. Actually, if you're out of seat, maybe Curt and Jason as well. Thanks so much. And then we happen to have Todd Ferris here as well. Yeah, we've got a plant in the audience. Technology research education. You might even agree. So if you want to go ahead and tell us, okay, what's the real story, Todd? You're the nice researchers. This is what you actually have to deal with. Go ahead and what is your take on what are our standardized approaches to this point that a lot of people here have done the cutting edge of, and you're often the ones that are okay, how do we actually make this practical?
So I'll introduce myself. Todd Ferris. I'm the Deputy CIO for the School of Medicine. I have been working in this space for my whole career, trying to make clinical data available for research purposes. I've worked with a lot of these folks very closely to help them get over those hurdles, but I fully acknowledge that it is a battle that many people die on the hill before they get over. And these folks are very perseverant, and I really applaud them because they did not die on the hill.
I do have arrows in my back.
I was so
Flipping along.
And it's you know, I constantly look at the organization and say, why are we shooting at them? But we are, and it's because they really want to make sure that we don't get sued, we don't, you know, get on the list for Medicare or in some sort of bad way, right? So that's, as an organization, we're trying to balance all of these things, and it makes for a really difficult journey. And I just fully agree with everything you guys said, and happy to chat about it. I don't think there's a right answer here.
Looks like we have a question in the room, and I see one online, but probably I'll go first.
So is 9 compliance offices the minimum number of compliance offices? Because you're doing this first, right? So you're making the rule book. Like, where do you see this going? And hopefully, will you get that down to at least like 4?
Well, I mean, even having a canonical list, even if it's 20 offices, would be a major
Yeah.
accomplishment. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
You have a
That's the
checklist you
mystery
love
of
to-
who to go to.
Anybody?
Yeah.
But I think you can break it though into sort of some very core areas. So you've got the privacy officer who are looking at from a privacy preserving perspective. So that's one group. You have your information security folks that they're going to ask you like, where are you hosting this? How are you protecting it? All those sort of things. You have your legal team who's saying, well, what are the laws? If you're going to release this into China, what is the issue? Do we have issues there? Is the government going to come after us? So they're going to be protecting from those. So those are your core pillars. And then below those, sometimes we unfortunately subdivide, right? And we've got OTL who wants to look at licensing and some of these other things. But those are your canonical.
Sometimes there's mirrorverse as well from hospital and university side, so you end up talking to dual
We're
offices.
trying
Yeah.
to coordinate those so that
Yeah.
you really.
And
So my favorite thing in all of this adventures was a call we had with 13 offices, not these 9 and another 4. That involved the security people, both SU and the hospital.
Yeah.
I forgot what the other 2 groups were. I think RMG was involved in some of them.
Probably. Yeah.
It's all documented. So for students onboarding in my research team, there's a section on read this if you ever want to release a data set. So it's no longer a mystery. But the hard part, as Todd mentions, is it's nobody's job to do this. And then it's the agony of connecting all of them. Now there's precedent, so that's good. But most of them have other works to do and they don't read your emails.
I found a comment thread when he asked him, it was like, we're not saying no, but we're just not going to be the ones to say yes. And so somebody else said, we're not saying no, we can't do it. Curt?
Yeah, I mean, we went through the process. I didn't find anyone who was extraneous to the process. As Todd says, there's these different buckets. And so I think the important thing is that you try to get everyone together in the same room. I think that's a good technique. And also just having, knowing who the right people are at each point. There is this issue of who is the decision maker. And I think that the institution's trying to get better at that. Yeah.
We got a question online. It is a very pragmatic one. Then I'd like to go through some synthetic questions. Layla Coopersmith, would you like to ask your question? It's going to be about like how to anonymize data, make it useful for others. Layla? Otherwise I can verbalize it. Her question was, what are your recommendations for anonymizing? And also I think someone should spell out what is de-identify versus anonymize. So these are not the same thing. So we're spelling that out. For anonymizing of fully scrubbing, what does that mean? Rare disease, oncology, and cell and gene therapy clinical trial data. So we can make that data available to be shared, and your recommendations for how that data can be shared with clinical trial sponsors who want to continue their trials for smaller populations using that data, but who want to go into themselves.
Oh, you are looking at
Okay. All right, set us
well,
straight.
because I have very strong views on this, and I there's the legal view, and then there's the sort of perspective of privacy, and I wore a privacy officer hat at one point. It's hard to remove that, and so you know, as we look at these models and we look at the number of data points in a vector representation, can you really ever de-identify somebody's clinical information? And it's an existential sort of discussion, right? The law says, well, if you remove these 18 identifiers, then it's considered DID under HIPAA. Will that change? I suspect that will change in the future. Because as these models get richer and richer, we will be able to
spell that little
re-identify.
safe harbor rule. Like technically, you remove these 19 identifiers, like age and MRN and phone number. You have de-identified, and like legally, I think you are allowed to share that data at that
You
point.
are. You
The
are.
item 18 you cannot guarantee. Item 18 is any other identifying characteristics or traits.
Ah, so it's
It is a catch-all, and it is open interpretation, but nobody has been sued over that. I mean, you said I removed anything that was identified, and at this point, as of today, no one has been sued over that.
But at least Stanford's current stance, even if you remove all that stuff, if you have notes, that's still too high risk. We will not let you share that without some proper structure.
Well, the question that we ask is, how do you know, to Nigan's point, that you removed any other identifying information from a clinical note?
How do you know I didn't?
Well, prove it.
Who's the burden of proof on?
So I maybe have a little bit diverse view on this, but the risk will never be zero.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so so there's sort of a spectrum. In the imaging world, let's say that you have the actual CT scan.
Mm-hmm.
There is no way to identify a patient from their CT scan.
Are you sure?
Yeah, so
It's not zero. It's not zero.
Okay.
But okay, give an example.
there was a study where by CT scan of the head,
Yes.
you can reconstruct their face.
Okay, that's an exception. I'm talking
So
about.
that's identifying.
I'm talking about abdomen, right? So we do strip faces from CTs. That's right. But let's take a CT of the abdomen.
Not today.
Yeah, I think there's a universe. I mean, you can identify people with gait. We're in a universe where you can link against the entire internet to bring in residual informationally. So the future is always shifting. So that zero probability is increasing monotonically as technology. Now,
So you
now,
think
what
you
is
can
the,
identify one person out of 3 billion or however many people in the world by their gait?
well, this is where we get. It is a vulnerability, and like, what is your acceptable tolerance of that
Right.
vulnerability under what conditions?
Yes.
And we always kind of punt. Like, well, I don't know. It's kind of hard.
I mean,
Yeah.
arguably, pulmonary layout is probably unique among people.
Yeah.
I mean, if you actually did a high-res CT of their chest and you did a 3D reconstruction, I suspect it is unique.
So
Right, but it
I
presumes.
mean,
I-
you
but
throw
in
the
order to-
genomics in there and
Yeah,
Right?
that's like, I think it's a distraction, like, you have,
It is totally a
it's an
distraction.
assumption that it is true. What do we do with that assumption? It's really.
There's no way, it's like saying that someone's fingerprints are unique, but there's no way of identifying someone from their fingerprints unless you already have their fingerprints.
Fingerprints, right.
Correct.
So
Right.
unless you already have a CT
Yeah.
of their chest and their
This is-
pulmonary arteries.
Yeah.
you
And
could
this is the
identify them, but you don't.
circular discussion we get into
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
the privacy and the legal folks. Because their argument is, well, what if somebody has their CT, they then could go look in this data set and say, that's me. And they say, well, that's a violation. We're like, well, but no, you already knew you.
Yeah, yeah.
But you get into these
Yeah.
circular discussions with
Yeah,
that.
there you go.
Yeah.
So
Some
the-
of the issues come out, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Tina first.
Yeah, some of these issues come out like where we have students come in and they're like, well, I de-identified the data set myself. And I'm like, no, there's a process. And so understanding, like you guys were saying, what is the process to de-identify these data sets? Because I've had multiple times where students have, for a publication had to deposit data and they're like, yeah, I just stripped, these things. And
I think that's
good
the
to
great,
go.
it's codifying a set of procedures, and then
Yeah.
that gives you at least the structure by which you can even contemplate assigning risk or measuring risk. It's this nebulous, everyone shoots from the hip and does their own thing, and some things are further than others, that really causes it to be challenging in ways that are frustrating as academics, I think.
So one thing I want to just give a plug for, because this was recognized as an issue, and so we started a pilot with the Privacy Office to do a de-identification as a service. So we've run probably 20 or so people through this. We already, as soon as we opened it up, it like filled up all the slots. People were like, if you're going to do this. And it turns out it's not easy, and there have been a lot of trouble with those pilots that you start to lose a lot of information out of those as we start to run them through the tools and start to remove those outliers. People are like, I didn't want this happening in my data set, but this
It
means
becomes a homogeneous data set, right?
It does.
So you lose all the outliers, yeah.
let's get some other people in the mix, maybe over here.
Well, my question is, what's next for public data sets? Last year, there's this health bench being published, and the interesting part is the rubrics that comes together with the EHR, all the rubrics for evaluating that data point by an LLM. I feel that publishing a data set is the work of making an effort to put a useful data set out there, and making an effort of annotating the data is a huge effort as well. So I'm wondering, in this era of reasoning, RL, what's the next for these public data sets?
Thoughts on comment? You can go, Curt.
I think what you're getting at is something that I think will be a growing use of public data sets, and that is benchmarking.
Yeah.
And so, that may be a sustainability model for something like Midrick, which I showed.
Yeah.
They've got a data set, and what we've intentionally done is held back 15-20% of the data set, which no one can see. So if a company were to come to Midrick and say, I want to use your data set to validate my chest x-ray model, we can then sample from that sequestered data set and use that as a validation set, and then partner with regulatory agency like FDA and say, and there's something called it's a 4-letter acronym, but it's essentially a development tool that FDA sanctions, MDDT I think it's called, and so then the FDA, you get kind of a fast track through the FDA because you've used a tool to validate that the FDA has already looked at and knows that it respects as a robust benchmark. So I think you'll start to see more of that rather than just saying, we're gonna let everything out.
Yeah.
We're gonna hold some of it back because that's gonna allow us to build these benchmarks and MedHelm and all of those things will, I think, be more accurate measures of model performance.
I think the synthetic data piece is also going to become more and more prominent as soon as we sort of, again, it's about benchmarking, right? Does it really represent the clinical complexity that you're trying to model in your data set? And I think it's going to be different for every question we ask. So having these like generalizable benchmarks is going to be really important.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish, like, data serves many purposes, right? And we're in a universe where, like, health bench. Benchmarks come and go. Humanity's last exam was at 0% like a year ago, now it's like 50%. Like, we exhaust benchmarks quickly for the purpose of ranking models. They have a short shelf life. A data set for discovery, or actually understanding core properties, things that are released to, like, learn new things about the etiology and progression of disease, are sort of a different thing, right? And so I think we'll see this splitting of sorts into how we managing this universe where we just need a lot of data to understand human health. But we also have these targeted, whether synthetic data or things like, Health Bench is already kind of antiquated, right, as a single turn or multi-turn. Like, we have an ability to create a target that you then chase and optimize for. Like, Frontier Labs are extremely good at that, and there's a lot of runway there for targeted benchmarking. But that's a very different route that I think is way more amenable to synthetic data and baking in assumptions than, like, the challenge of really understanding human health, which is something that's much harder to, I think, crack in, like, what we're talking about, because synthetic data wipes out data.
Yeah. Talking about synthetic data. So I fully sign on to everything Tina said. I think the role for synthetic data is going to be data imputation and data augmentation. Okay, so in imaging world, we do like skews and rotations and flips and so forth as a means of data augmentation. And I think synthetic images can also be a means of data augmentation. There's someone in Akshay Chaudhary's lab named Steffi Moriano who did some nice work on looking at what would be the optimal use if you had some real data and some synthetic data. What's the right training mechanism? It's the ratio, but also the sequence. Mm-hmm. And so what she showed was that training on just synthetic data is much worse than training on just real data. But the optimal training method is using the pre-training with the synthetic data and fine-tuning on the real data.
Interesting.
And but then you only get just a little bit. So again, it's like data augmentation. You get a little bit bump in performance, but it's not magical. and in no way, as you said, in no way is synthetic data a substitute for real data.
Plenty more, but why don't we go over here and I'll come back.
So I want to go back to this the point about can you ever make something really de-identified? Really, this is an issue. This is coming from a clinical trial where we have a lot more control. But the issue came up where we had a problem with the consent, and I'm curious how you all are thinking about, given how fast things are moving, given this problem that we can't fully de-identify, what should the consent process look like? One of you mentioned that going back and confirming the consent was right, that could have been an uh-oh moment of like, well, now we're kind of behind. What should we do in the future?
I think we need to be much more explicit that we're in a world where there are these massive data sets and they're being used to train these models. And I also believe that we have to provide explicitly for commercial use. So I think that the world would be a better place if we are able to, we Stanford are able to share de-identified data for appropriate commercial purposes, because that's how these innovations reach patients, is through companies. And so if a company comes to us and says, I have this chest x-ray model, it would be really great if I could train on your 225,000 chest x-rays, which are sitting there on the website that I just have to click a box and download and use, but I can't do it because I'm a commercial entity. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think that's where we ought to go. I also think that we ought to have an opt-out, but it ought to be hard to opt out. Like, I think it ought to be almost the same as when you come to an academic place, you should expect that your data is going to be used in that way. We have to show that we're going to do it responsibly, but you should expect it just as you expect. You can't say, I want to come to Stanford, but I don't want to be treated by a resident, right? I mean, it's just.
You can say it.
You can say it, but after anesthesia,
You're consenting to that. Like, if you don't want that, you have to go down the street to somewhere else, right? And so I think it's kind of inherent in what we do. It's inherent in our mission. And so I think we just need to make it a little more explicit to the patient. And I think the patients are glad to do that. But I do think it's our responsibility. And David Magnus likes to say, I'll just end with this, that consent is not a piece of paper. So our current consent process is broken. I'm coming in for my colonoscopy, someone shoves a bunch of papers in front, you gotta sign all of these. If I wanna talk about consent and what's gonna happen to that person who's across the desk from me, has no way they're not equipped to discuss any of those issues. So that's not real consent in my view. So how we fix that is maybe more complicated, but we need to work on it.
And I think it's about partnerships, right? So partnering with these commercial entities to really, because we gain, right? We gain when they use our data. Patients, partnering with patients, right? They oftentimes are willing to share more data than we actually have if we show them it's a partnership, right? And where everyone has aligned sort of incentives. So it's really important to get that right, I think, moving forward, because otherwise it's 19 pages of OTL and this and that, which is just a huge barrier.
So I have two thoughts on that. So one, I want to just follow up what Curt said, and so we have consent, and then you have terms and conditions. So terms and conditions, for those who aren't familiar, are those things you don't get to negotiate when you come into the hospital. It is, if you want to come here, you need to sign this. And just to be very clear, in the T's and C's, it does say we are a research institution. And by coming here, you agree that some of your data may be used for research purposes, which will be approved by the IRB. So I just want to be really clear, we make that upfront and center in our T's and C's. We still screw up, to your point. Like, I was on the baseline study. We thought we got that consent right. We worked hard on that consent. Fast forward 10 years, lawyers looking at it, things have changed. We're not able to do everything we wanted to do with that consent. Now we're looking at, do we have to go back? Do we have to modify it? Very similar situation. I wish we could always get the language right, but the world moves, the laws change. And this is what's challenging with these sort of forward-looking consents.
We're squeezing this, and I actually have any questions online.
Yeah.
It's on my slide.
How do you think about data sets of data types that don't exist as yet? So that aren't hard-coded. So for imaging, it's the conversation about the context. For your example, it's the bias. You've spoken a lot about tacit knowledge. So these are data types that influence day-to-day practice, but don't exist. They're ephemeral, but they're very much relevant to the patient and to the data type. So how do you create a data set of that?
Can you give an example of what you're talking about? I'm not trying to understand.
So if a CT report, a CT accompanied by a report is not the same thing as a CT that's discussed at multidisciplinary radiology rounds. There's context given, there's anecdotes given, there's discussions, and depending upon who's there in the room, the one with the louder voice wins, and that causes bias. And there's decision making that results in a report, but the report doesn't capture the chain of thought.
I mean, I think all of our medical data is mediated by how it's captured, right? We don't have a stenographer recording the reality of everything,
Right.
and that's just how it is. And should we, measure if it's problematic and develop new ways to capture it? Absolutely, I think that's a great research direction. But it's like there's no one size fits all solution to that.
And I will say every data set is biased in some way, right? And so what's important is understanding, is there a bias that affects the question you're asking? And what are the implications of that bias?
I would argue that clinical notes attempt to gather some of that if the team documents in the clinical note.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're forced to impute what they were thinking based on their next actions, right? Because if they sent that person to surgery, then they clearly thought something, versus using a medical sort of procedure on that.
I'll mention some research in my lab that I think gets to your point. So, normally when we're training models to interpret images and like draft reports, let's say, you do contrastive learning with the report and the image. But what we find is that if you use, for example, you can use a commercial language model to create a chain of thought that the radiologist might have gone through in order to create the report, because that's only really capturing, like you say, kind of a subset of what the thoughts were. You can actually, using those chains of thought as training, you can actually improve the performance of the model somewhat. And then Sonali Shawn is a student she's gone out and captured actual chains of thought. So she's asking radiologists, and so she captured, I think now 100,000 chains of thoughts on chest x-rays, and it's showing that when you train on the chains of thought, you get much better performance. So there's a lot of labor involved in that, right? But actually you're right, there probably is a layer of information that we can use to train models that's much more than what's in the EHR, but capturing that is going to be a challenge.
I'm gonna try to squeeze in some people online for you. I would think about, when you're talking about synthetic data, just a different thing of this. I think you're describing like train a model on the real data and have it be a generative model, make up new examples. And then what if it actually makes a real one that you never know? Another thing we're finding is like, for medical benchmarking, reasoning benchmarking, if you're doing epidemiology, like you need to know what the average blood pressure is, you know what the average age is, but for medical reasoning, you don't need to know that. It just needs to be close enough to a real case. So can I take a real case and perturb it, change a few diagnoses, change some of the lab results, and a doctor will double check, like the meaning is still the same, but there's nothing to re-identify. There's no patient like that anymore. And I don't even think synthetic is the right word there. I'm kind of calling this reconstructed cases. But I also realize I'm making this up. And I have not found anybody to confirm or deny that is a valid approach. Matt Weeks, are you online? He has a lot of thoughts and comments on how data can be used, and if you'd like to put a focused question to the panel.
First here, I'm just often lurking in the borderline here. This is a really fantastic conversation, especially those of us building solutions in industry right away. We depend on the research community to help us with things, including synthetic data, because it's so hard to get cohorts to test our systems and our logic. The things we're worried about is that synthetic data will be, disregarded and invalidated, which would invalidate our entire business model, or worse yet, create harm. The other bit, though, is that as we see these kinds of studies out there, most of the mere mortals out here don't know what the proportion of core or foundational data to synthetic data is safe. And these are the kinds of things that aren't well known. And I think as we're running around here building agentic processes that can, as the CMS says, deflate healthcare costs and increase coverage and increase access, especially as we're doing things like augmenting care, non-medical interventions, things like that, that really are pretty straightforward, and at the same time, you know, are going to require a lot of us to build small language models so that we don't have that big overhead. And we're going to use the data that you in research create. But it's a little scary out here because we see actors getting in trouble. We see health systems having institution guardrails and having data partially re-identified. Anyway, go ahead.
Matt, you have to ask a question within 10 seconds. Go ahead.
How do we know how much is enough?
It's one.
That is a great research question. I mean, I think, you know, any grad student would say that's a great question to try to answer. In Akshay's lab, this woman Steffi I mentioned, that's the experiments that she did. There's a paper on arXiv, you know, I can send you a link, but she looked at, okay, what ratio of real to synthetic, what training orders and all of that, and it's sort of an empiric question, and that's one answer for one type of image, and you know, and so forth. But there's probably similar answers for EHR data and tabular data, etc. So yeah, those are still research questions that people ask.
I think the issue is there's no standard for what needs to be reported, so most people aren't even reporting this ratio, right? And so we see all these synthetic data sets coming out or models built on a portion of synthetic data, but we don't know that ratio. And so one of the things I think is really important is we need to, you know, really have some standards in what we need to see from the synthetic data, and how much of those edge cases or, you know, complex cases get erased from that data set. And so I think it's a great question. There's a couple papers out regarding clinical data, not imaging data, but there's no clear answer right now.
Awesome. We are past the hour, so we're going to formally break. Thank you to our panel for a fantastic discussion. There's a line more. All experts in the field. They have blazed the trail. They've cut through the jungle. There is precedent. You can talk to people who have gone through before. Thank you, everybody. Wait, please go.
I was going to say one thing. I think we have to say we are all lucky that at Stanford we have leaders who are forward-looking and recognize and progressive and recognize the value of doing this and aren't looking for ways to say no. They're looking for ways to say yes. And it is a complicated process, but you know there are a lot of other institutions where this is just simply not possible. So
I have to tell the recruits, here it is very difficult. Elsewhere it is impossible. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Fun conversation.
Thank you for doing it.
It's part of it's a subset. It's like a turd.
So I think I'm trying to say
I know.
I accepted a role.
Oh, you already know.
Yes.
So on the scale of real data, which is completely fake, this is negative, I would say more towards the real. I think that's right. Some people get things like, well, I'd rather not get sued.
But we should have money prior to
So maybe I should do that. Okay, so that's about it.
I mean, people haven't given it a name, so I think what we should do is we should create a case real. We should create a case de-identified. We should create a case chain perturbation, and we should create a case that is synthetic. And like, for example, the same situation, let's make a picture.
Maybe I need to go to something.
That's exactly it. And once we have that picture, we can simulate. We're talking about this. I might actually do it just for class, because I already have the other three.
And somewhat
So,
Alright, so, one of my close that Fraser is there.
Yeah, yeah, so,